When Capcom's first Resident Evil hit store shelves, it was a massive and unexpected success. Sony and its PlayStation console were still newcomers to the gaming market, and Resident Evil was one of their first major system sellers. But when Sega announced that they were coming out with their Dreamcast console years before the PS2 would be ready, Capcom decided to make a major title for that system while making a spin-off game for the PlayStation. But Sony swooped in and signed an exclusivity deal with the studio, forcing them to switch the names and make the sequel the spin-off, and the spin-off the sequel. Sony thought they had dodged a bullet. Resident Evil's main games would now stay on their consoles, keeping that fan base loyal to them. But like any industry, corporate deals can be slippery in gaming, and before they knew it, Sony found their darling franchise had run away with another console. While wildly successful, Japanese juggernaut Nintendo was starting to gain a reputation as the kiddie company. They had their Mario and they had their Zelda, but the rest of the market was starting to focus on more mature content. Recognizing that they needed to branch out a little, they came to Capcom and asked if they could have their Undead. So in January 2000, the studio announced that they were making a franchise prequel called Resident Evil 0 for the Nintendo 64. They said that the game would be out by the end of the year. But it wouldn't be a Resident Evil game if it actually finished the way it was supposed to. Sure enough, in September, Capcom held a surprise press conference. Not only would Resident Evil 0 be scrapped and rebuilt from the ground up for Nintendo's new GameCube console, but Resident Evil was going to become a GameCube exclusive franchise. That's right. Sony's deal to keep the main franchise on their system had only lasted one game. From now on, Capcom would be taking the kiddie company's new machine and scaring the pants off of it. And if all that wasn't enough, the father of the series, Shinji Mikami, announced that he would be returning to the director's chair to make a new game, or rather, an old game. He would be making Resident Evil, the game that started it all. Again, but for the GameCube. It was a blow for Sony, who had thought they'd locked the franchise to their platform. Still, Sony was an enormous multimedia giant, and it had more going for it than just the PlayStation. In March 2002, Sony Pictures, through its Screen Gems subsidiary, released Resident Evil. Made relatively cheaply by B-movie director Paul W.S. Anderson and starring Mila Jovovich, it went on to do fairly good business. It ended up spawning a franchise, one of the few in which each successive movie did better than the last. Despite the reputation that game-to-film adaptations aren't any good, Resident Evil movies are among the few to have turned a profit. And only a month later, Resident Evil released for the GameCube. No, this wasn't a movie tie-in, this was the Mikami-directed remake of the original game. However, while it kept the same characters, plot, and setting, it was otherwise largely reworked with different rooms and puzzles. Old fans would be getting a new experience. But that said, it went back to some of the old conventions, including fixed cameras, clunky controls, and pre-rendered backgrounds. Back in 1996, pre-rendered backgrounds made the game look a generation ahead of its time. It would be no different in 2002, and many critics cited the game as one of the best looking on any system. More importantly than the actual look was the atmosphere. And if there was one thing Mikami was good at, it was atmosphere. Despite being a remake, it was praised as being one of the scariest games ever made. With tons of replay value, including 10 possible endings, 2002's Resident Evil was a success for Capcom and proof that a Nintendo console could go mature. But a movie and a game in 1 year wasn't enough. In November came Resident Evil 0, the prequel originally meant for the Nintendo 64, now on the GameCube. As a prequel, 0 set up the events of the original title. In other words, Capcom released a remake of the first game before releasing a prequel to the first game. Regardless, like its predecessor, or successor, or whatever, Resident Evil 0 was praised for nailing down its terrifying atmosphere. But all that being said, there was a complaint. It was the same complaint as on the last game, and the game before that, and the one before that. Resident Evil wasn't evolving. Fixed cameras, clunky controls, despite different characters and settings, it was the same old game. And while the fan base was still loyal, they were getting fewer and fewer new gamers to try it. Still in all, the game sold 1.25 million copies, proving that even if the franchise was getting as stale as its zombies, it still had as much life left in it as its zombies. But Capcom knew enough was enough, and tried to invent a new formula. They had already attempted to introduce light gun mechanics into the series with Resident Evil Survivor and Resident Evil Dead Aim, but these games were dismissed by critics and gamers alike. In December 2003 in Japan and March 2004 in North America, Resident Evil Outbreak broke out on the PS2. This would be a dramatic shift in structure. It would not feature one hero alone, but 8 different ordinary citizens, each with their own unique weapons and abilities. It would not be one long experience, but consist of 5 different scenarios that were basically unrelated. It would not be played alone, but with a total of 4 characters, whether they be other players online or bots offline. And it would not feature any real plot, instead letting the different character interactions drive the story in each scenario. Sadly, most reviewers claim that the good idea was undercooked. The controls were still wonky, and there was no good way to communicate with other players. Voice chat was not supported. Nobody thought that it was a bad game per se, but there was nothing to really make it stand out. The game did not sell well and was largely ignored. Then again, as a zombie horror game with 4-player online co-op in several small scenarios, its influence clearly lived on as an early precursor to Valve's Left 4 Dead series. Resident Evil was a massive series reaching its end. But Capcom didn't want their cash cow put out to pasture. It needed a massive overhaul. It needed to adapt to its time without selling out or becoming derivative. They needed the one man who had always struck gold with the franchise he'd started in the first place. They needed Shinji Mikami. He gave them a horror title so good, it is still considered one of the best games of any kind ever made. Tune in next time to see terror become terrific.